Hello and welcome to another episode of This Week in Cleantech. It's a roundup of the week's biggest stories you need to know in climate and clean energy in 15 minutes or less, or sometimes longer, as the case may be this week. Today is Friday, June 28th, 2024. I'm Renewable Energy World Editor-in-Chief John Ingle. We have Tim McDonnell from Semafor, one of the best climate reporters going right now, I would argue, Mike Casey. But for now, I'm joined by Mike Casey of TigerCom. Hey, Mike.
How are you, friend?
I'm good. I'm coming off of a very successful Grid Tech Connect Forum California event that we had in Newport Beach this week. And as I mentioned on the last show, one of your good friends, Dan Sugar, the CEO of Nextracker, was part of our keynote, as was Tim Haid, the co-founder of Scale Microgrids. And it was incredible. Really, really great audience, really engaged around some of these issues of interconnection and, you know, developers and utilities and regulators playing in the same sandbox and getting along to try to take on, you know, some of these critical choke points. So it's a fun event to do. It's small, but impactful. So thanks for your help, Mike.
It's no problem. And John, I think our listeners noted that last week you simulated a no pen, and we've decided we're going to mail you your own no pen so you can have it for the show.
Well,
so
lucky for me, you do not have my address, Mike, and you won't get it. So there you go. Except for when Christmas cards are ready, because I do want one of those. You have a beautiful family, so keep me in the loop. All right. We want to thank all of our listeners who keep sending in those recommendations and comments about the length of the episode or how fast we talk or what sound effects that I make with my mouth. You can keep sending those in at rew@clarionevents.com, and we will get to the Cleantecher of the week later on in the episode. All right, Mike. Number one.
Mark Sherman of AP has a story. Supreme Court halts enforcement of the EPA's plan to limit downwind pollution from power plants. I will let you start, Mr. Engel.
Okay, so the EPA's Good Neighbor rule, designed to limit pollution from power plants affecting downwind areas, has been paused by the Supreme Court. The rule was finalized just last year, and the EPA found that power plant pollution dropped by 18% in 2023 in the 10 states where the rule is enforced. Seemingly good news. The pause will last until the Federal Appeals Court in Washington finishes reviewing objections to the rule from industry and Republican-led states. Ohio, Indiana, and West Virginia say the rule is costly and ineffective. They also noted that courts in 12 other states have paused it, undermining the EPA's goal of a unified approach across 23 states to reduce ozone pollution. Mike Casey.
Well, of course they did this. From the people who are enjoying undisclosed junkets on the dime of wealthy polluting interests, you get this decision. So, you know, call me paranoid, but someone once said, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. Americans deserve access to clean air. We have 1,300 of them die prematurely every year from that air pollution across the state borders, and most of the locations affected include low-income and disadvantaged communities. Those objecting to the rule say it is costly, but of course, they leave out of those calculations the cost of the status quo on human health and the ability to secure our energy supplies in this country from foreign dictators. This decision enables the polluting industry to keep on chugging along, harming communities that locate hundreds of miles away from their operations. John, story number two.
Yeah, this one's from Reuters, titled U.S. Energy Production Exceeds Consumption by Widest Recorded Margin. Mike.
All right. Last year, the U.S. produced more energy than it consumed by over 2 gigawatts. Energy production rose 4%, mostly due to the increase in natural gas and crude oil production, while energy consumption eased 1%. Now, renewables generation is up 1% over last year. Coal consumption dropped 17%. So coal consumption is now at its lowest level in over 100 years as generators retire and renewables become increasingly competitive. John, your thoughts?
Yeah, we won't need as much energy from coal and gas plants in the future if this trend continues, which could lead to more coal plant closures than we already see. Now, all of this is pending an election that's coming up in November. And while not making it into this roundup of stories, the debate last night left a lot to be desired on the energy and climate front, almost to the point where it doesn't belong in this episode because nothing was said. So back to the issue at hand. More energy efficiency requirements have been brought to the table, which will hopefully lower global energy consumption, even alongside a rising population. And just this Wednesday, Ohio House lawmakers approved a bill that would charge ratepayers $1.50 a month to pay utilities for energy efficient appliances and practices. And next week in Vermont, new energy efficiency building rules will kick in to make homes more eco-friendly. This gets back to Mike Casey. A megawatt saved is as good as a megawatt generated, and it's a whole of a hell of a lot cheaper and easier to deploy. Mike, our third story.
You're fired up today, John Engel.
I feel good. I have all next week off, so you are one of my last meetings of the week. So this can either go really well or really poorly. So you can send me into Independence Day with a smile, Mike.
I'm doing my best. Third story, Catherine Morehouse from E&E News. Coal power plant outages remain historically high. NERC report finds.
I love this one, and I love these kinds of reports because it shows people that reliability and resilience is not just an issue facing renewable variable sources. Natural gas does really bad in the cold. It struggles in the extreme heat. Coal is facing its own reliability issues. So for the last 3 years, coal power plants have seen more unplanned outages than other power sources. NERC reported that the outages and performance issues were due to reduced maintenance on aging units as they phase out. And they were also more cycling coal units that needed to turn off and on during the day to better align with wind and solar. And if you need another example, look back a couple of years to Texas with Winter Storm Uri. One of the biggest issues was the availability of natural gas as a fuel source to these power plants. It was not just the freezing blades of a wind turbine that you saw on the internet. Mike, I feel a little juice.
You are juiced.
Yeah, this one's getting me going. This lineup's good.
We should have put you on the debate stage last night, John.
No, I wouldn't have done well in that format.
All right, we want coal plants phased out. That is clear. The faster we deploy renewables, the faster we can shut these turkeys down before they need maintenance to stay reliable. It makes zero sense to conduct maintenance on a power plant that's on its way to being phased out. It also highlights the importance of battery storage and its ability to continuously keep clean electricity flowing through the grid. So eventually you don't need coal plants to quote unquote cycle anymore. I will say, John, I think in the weeks ahead, we're going to be hearing about a corrupt practice called self-dispatching, where utilities that own coal plants that retrofit them with scrubbers many years ago, instead of paying out of their pocket, they did municipal bonds. They now turn the coal plants on and off at higher costs and pass them on to ratepayers just so they can pay the bonds. They get the bonds paid for with ratepayer money instead of their own. It's an interesting practice that's going to come to surface, you see.
Reminds me of a certain scandal from 20 plus years ago called Enron. Does it not?
Very much. John, I think you were in junior high school back then during Enron?
Oh, no, buddy. I was like 7 years old. But I was watching closely, and I had my eyes on those smartest guys in the room. And I was not going to let them off the hook 20 years later when I was in this industry. So I pushed away the Cheerios and the string cheese and said, let's get to work.
Are my dentures fitting okay? Can you just take a quick look?
Right. Were you in junior high school with Enron or no? Okay. We'll move on. So story number 4. I saw this one. I loved it from Mark Chediak of Bloomberg this morning. Wildfire threats make utilities uninsurable in the U.S. West. Mike.
Some power companies in the U.S. have faced tens of billions of dollars in damages from wildfires linked to their lines. Some insurance companies now have withdrawn their coverage for utilities linked to wildfires caused by their power lines. If the power lines from an uninsured utility end up starting a fire, that utility is likely to go bankrupt. And the risk is that this will only get worse as we see wildfire season ramp up from climate change-driven thoughts. I think if utilities enjoy this position as too important to fail, this will be a test of their market viability. So we'll see, John.
Yeah, and the impacts here are really interesting because it's not just the Pacific Corps or Xcels or PG&E who have Hawaiian Electric who have had a hand in these fires because of their systems either not taking proactive steps or not shutting off when there's a fault or an issue on the line. It's all the other utilities too who haven't done anything wrong are seeing their premiums go through the roof. And I had some conversations at Gridtech this week with some senior people on the utility wildfire side, and they say that it's a very tricky and dangerous circumstance for them to navigate because this is all going to be passed to consumers when these costs go up.
Yes, it will.
So one of the interesting things from Mark's piece, insurance rates have already risen 30% this year, with premiums also on the rise. I mentioned Pacific Corp, a Western utility, saw their premiums increase 400% from 2019 through 2022. This insurance problem makes it harder for utilities to attract investments and funding to improve and build more transmission, making infrastructure less prone to start fires and install weather monitoring equipment. Now utilities are turning to state governments for help by pushing for state-level catastrophic fire insurance funds. California has a program like that. Even they're dumping some utilities. PG&E has also started their own strategy of self-insuring by setting money aside in the case a wildfire happens. And I also spoke to the manager of PG&E's transmission strategy, Mike, and he said, don't look at these issues of wildfire mitigation in a vacuum, because PG&E's hyper-focus on wildfires now is impacting everything else. Interconnection, transmission planning, customer engagement, smart metering, advanced controls, all of that takes a back seat when you're in the midst of a bankruptcy caused by an issue like this. And every single utility, especially out west, is looking at this really closely. Story number 5, and our guest this week, a friend of ours at this point, I think we can call him
Tim McDonald. He might be the second timer we've had on the show, John.
No, that's not true. That's not true. But we'll have to go back through our logs. He might be, can I say, because I don't think the other second timer would remember or listen to the show, he's my favorite.
Oh, geez, Louise. John, you are such a suck up. Tim, welcome to the show. You have a story. The solution to the AI power boom is a better grid, not a bigger one. I am just fascinated by this piece.
It's such a good story.
For people who have not read it, and we want you to read it, what is the big takeaway?
I think the big takeaway from this is sort of twofold. So we talk, you guys talk a lot about, and I think people are aware of the power demand increase that we're expecting to see in the future from AI and electric vehicles, and electrifying the economy as a whole, and utilities thinking through at this early stage kind of how to plan for that. And while this, at the same time that's happening, thinking about this kind of big expansion of the grid, what's like the sort of most cost effective or easiest or sort of best way to approach that. And I think we're all familiar with the challenges around building physical infrastructure, permitting reform, interconnection, all these issues. So what this story was trying to look at is sort of turning the AI issue on its head and thinking about not just AI as a power suck or a kind of problem for the grid, but also part of the solution, that utilities are increasingly turning to artificial intelligence and machine learning to help run the grid better and to try to get more mileage, more capacity out of the existing infrastructure that we have, so that we can start to solve this kind of load issue. I wouldn't call it a problem necessarily, but load kind of planning in a way that doesn't necessarily all fall on building new wires and substations, because that's going to be very expensive and complicated. So I was just looking at some of the approaches that different companies are trying to try out here for that.
And Tim, it's great to see an outlet like yours covering the issue in that way, because I think especially at the higher, more mainstream level, the story has just been, how are utilities going to keep up? They're not going to be able to keep up. I think utilities, by and large, at least in the conversations I have at the trade media level, are saying, look, I know it's unprecedented load growth, but we'll adapt, and load growth is not necessarily a net negative for us, because that's how we, feed the rate base. One data point I want to call out from a previous story I wrote was a new EPRI study that said data centers could consume up to 9% of U.S. electricity generation by 2030. That's a crazy amount of new load. And we know that bringing on these data centers takes a minimum in the United States of 36 months. So yeah. I'm interested in what specifically some of those tools were in the conversations you had, Tim, of is it flexible interconnection or, creative interconnection agreements that would allow for the more seamless onboarding of some of these heavy industrial users, whether that be a data center or a factory, or, they're all kind of seen as the same in the big picture.
Yeah, so I mean, one that we talk about in the story is something that National Grid, this startup that National Grid Partners has invested in, called Line Vision, where they're basically using remote sensing of power lines and kind of measuring the way that they are moving in the wind, or even sort of how flexible they are, but kind of keeping kind of track of their physical characteristics in real time, which gives you some insight into, can you send more power through that particular line at any given time? And a lot of these kind of come back to that like dynamic line rating kind of category of, I think there's a sense among utilities now that, historically that they have had very little visibility into kind of what exactly is happening on the grid at any one moment. They have a kind of sense of, supply and demand in a general kind of way, but like knowing this particular line is, blowing in the wind and we shouldn't send more power there, or it's kind of stable and we can, or, getting that kind of flexibility, or like this, this particular house is ramping up or ramping down, and we can kind of leverage that in a virtual power plant kind of way, or, all of these kind of data-driven insights that you kind of need AI at some level to help parse or make sense of. So that's an example of one. There's also, you were mentioning wildfires earlier in the episode. There's some work being done to kind of use satellite imagery and process that with AI to detect, signs of wildfire earlier on when they happen, or kind of do some planning around wildfire preparedness using remote sensing or remote images like that. So I think that's kind of what all of these add up to is ways of just getting a better insight into what's happening on the grid and being able to plan for that.
Tim, I've seen talk on LinkedIn among very deep power forecasting nerds that say they're essentially the counter voice on AI's load explosion. And given what I do for a living, I don't have nearly the expertise to judge that. In your reporting, did you come away at all skeptical that the load is going to grow so explosively through AI and data centers, or do you think the conventional wisdom is correct, that the dotted line goes up very steeply from here?
Yeah, I mean, I also I don't have like a ton of technical insight into this. I would also sort of defer to the a study from a place like EPRI that John cited earlier. I think they probably have a good idea. But my perspective on it is more how much do we kind of view this as a crisis or not? And I think that there's this sort of conventional wisdom that like this type of load growth is in some at this. To do this much load growth in a short period of time and in a way that is zero carbon or low carbon, it is unprecedented, and it's not something that utilities have really had to do before. And so, but I think, is that a cause for panic? I don't know. I think utilities have a reputation that's maybe unfair, that they've kind of developed over time of being places that are not necessarily focused on innovation, but are kind of very, focused on reliability, and for very good reason, and, kind of tend to play their cards in a very safe way. And this is a moment where maybe, that needs to be pushed a little bit. And I think, I do think that utilities are up to the challenge and, are thinking about this in a really creative way, because as John said, it's their, it's their customer base that's at stake. So I think there probably is, whether it's from AI or EVs or electrifying heavy industry or, all the other things that or electrifying houses, all the other things that we have to do, there definitely is load growth coming. And, I think it's just how do we plan for that in the kind of smartest way, most cost effective way? I think if we get started on that now, there's a lot of solutions that can really help.
I think Mike makes a good point, though, because these chips are getting more and more efficient. NVIDIA is cutting their energy demand by, it seems like 20% every time they make an announcement. So, we have that proof of innovation. And I know we're going long here, but this is a super interesting topic. I'm curious if you felt optimistic based on your conversations. You mentioned grid and line vision, that these innovations can go from pilot to scale. We see utilities all over the country like to try little things, and they pilot here and they pilot there, and sometimes it goes nowhere. But I think the fear here is always with gold plating. And will utilities go out and build as much resources they possibly can to meet these gigantic forecasts? And maybe there's a more cost-effective way to do that, but FERC and other regulatory bodies aren't making them consider grid-enhancing technologies like DLR, dynamic line rating, which you just referred to in that case study. Does there need to be further intervention here to make sure that we don't develop a system that could potentially be obsolete?
Well, I think that's a very real concern, because I mean that's always been the way, right? That they build for the sort of maximum load day and play it as conservatively as possible, and we all appreciate that, because then we get the power that we need. And I can definitely tell you, speaking as someone who's based in Ukraine right now, where we have very much the opposite problem, that I appreciate that kind of planning for the kind of worst case scenario, but and that their utilities business model has been kind of based on that, as you said. I think that there does need to be some oversight here to make sure that that we're making these choices in the smartest and most cost effective way, and not just building. You could just build a bunch of gas peaker plants and cover all of this need in a way
could.
Like very
and some places will.
Yeah, that will happen. And so, I mean, but what kind of oversight is needed to make sure that that's not what happens? I mean, I do think from my experience talking to some utilities that are at the forefront of this, I think they have a genuine interest in innovation. I think they want to save themselves money and operate more efficiently, and they can find ways through AI to leverage their assets in a more profitable way for themselves. So this is not all just sort of like, climate do-gooderism, but they have a selfish interest in operating more effectively. So I think many of them will, hopefully. And it's going to be really interesting to see how that develops.
Well, Tim, give us 30 seconds about the situation in Ukraine. We don't get to talk to people there very much. You are calling in from Kiev, right? So yes. Give us 30 seconds on that, because we want to get to close, but we just don't want to let you go without asking.
So the situation is not very good. Russia has destroyed about half of the generating capacity in Ukraine by now. They've been escalating their attacks on energy infrastructure in the last couple of months. Ukraine now has about 8 or 9 gigawatts of generating capacity in the country, and their peak demand in the wintertime is 18. So there is definitely going to be a major shortfall. And I've spoken to people in government, people in the private sector, people in state-owned energy companies here, kind of analysts across the board. There's very wide agreement that maybe 1 or 2 gigawatts might get added this year in repair, but it's definitely by the time we get to winter, later this summer when it gets hotter and the winter, there's going to be very heavy blackouts. And the biggest problem that people cite is air defense. They can't rebuild anything that's going to just get destroyed again the next day, which is what always happens. And they are very much in need of more air defense here. And apart from that, the investment climate in Ukraine is very challenging for a number of reasons. We can do a whole episode on that later, but it's hard to get private capital in the energy sector invested here. But some companies are trying. GE Vernova is trying to get some more investment happening there. And when I spoke to their executives recently, who had just been meeting with the Ukrainian energy minister, their commitment was to let buyers in Ukraine kind of jump to the front of their queue, because they have a multi-year backlog for all of this, wind hardware, gas hardware, all of this stuff that they build globally is in very high demand. So what they're doing is to just let Ukraine jump to the head of the line on all of that. But still, it's going to be very challenging to get the grid operational here by the winter time. So we'll see what happens.
And Tim, we really hope you and your family stay safe when you're over
Yes.
there. A quick plug to an organization Mike and I both know, Energize Ukraine. If you in the industry are, have access to supply chain or even used product, they are asking for everything from solar panels to, I know no one has transformers sitting in a warehouse, but that's the kind of stuff that they need. And they've got a pretty detailed list ranging from big components to small components that you can help address some of those supply chain concerns. Because I've heard the same thing, Tim. They're not building anything they can't put underground or put in a shelter. And that's a pretty stark thing to think about. So really appreciate that context, and any help people can provide would be greatly appreciated. I know.
Thank you. Thank you.
John, we're just about out of time. Let's go to our Cleantecher of the week.
Yeah, our Cleantecher of the week is Warwick Wise, head of video at ABB. He went out to the plains of New Mexico to see how the latest detection and monitoring technology helped find methane leaks and seal them off. We like to hear that. So congratulations to Warwick.
Well, I want to thank our wonderful producer, Brian Mendez, and for Claire Quirin and Alex Peterson for gathering these stories this week.
Yeah, and big thanks to Tim McDonnell for joining us on This Week in Cleantech, who I now consider a co-host at this point. We'll just keep having him on every week. I think that'd be a good addition.
My pleasure.
All right, please subscribe, give us feedback, and share your story recommendations. And on Monday, we do have a new episode of Factor This. C-Power's CEO, Michael Smith, one of the leaders in virtual power plants, talking about how that industry has matured from green tech hype cycle to maybe something that's ready to play with the big boys. So looking forward to that one. Mike, Tim, thank you, and have a great weekend.
Yeah, we're going to be dark for the next 2 weeks, folks. So talk to you in 3 weeks, John Engel.
All right.
Tim, good seeing you. Take care.
Thank you both so much.